In today's complex environment, almost every major project, from mining to transmission lines, is contentious. Hi, my name is Allie Mears.
And I'm Byng.
Welcome to Primary Risk, where each month we speak with the people behind the projects shaping our world.
We'll be hosting candid conversations and hearing from industry leaders, political figures, engineers, and project proponents. We'll be exploring the soft issue risks, challenges, and solutions, and behind-the-scenes stories of what it took to get these complex projects across the finish line. Or not.
Steve Swaffield serves as principal and president of Carbex Consulting, advising clients in the energy sector. He served as chair of the board of the Canada Development and Investment Corporation and the Canada Growth Fund, and was a board member of Trans Mountain Corporation and Canada Hibernia Holding Corporation. He is vice chair of the board for Rugby Canada and sits on the board of Fortis BC. He has held leadership roles with British Gas Canada, Canaccord Financial, Terracin Inc., and RBC Capital Markets, and held senior roles at Shell International Petroleum Company. He holds an MBA from INSEAD and MA and BA honors in engineering science from Oxford University. He has contributed to various advisory boards and community organizations. Steve, we're so glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
On the Sedgwick
We've been
Primary
after him for
Risk
a while, actually.
podcast. I know. I feel like Byng has talked about you so much,
Well, I'm
always
sorry
with
about that
glowing.
too.
But you have to understand, when someone is involved in the rugby world, they immediately go up like 10 pegs on Byng's radar of people. So I know that you have a storied career that we'll get into, but I know that's your connection through the rugby world.
Absolutely. Happy to
Got
be
his
here.
Rugby Canada pin on.
I saw that as soon as
Yep.
he came in. Yeah. Well, Steve, we're really happy to have you here. And we always start by just getting to know our podcast guests a bit more. It's really about learning more about the people behind major projects. So tell us, you were in Oxford, you have this really fancy degree and master's.
It's Oxford, though.
It's Oxford, though.
Yeah.
And yes, we know Byng is, a little bit conflicted by that, given he has his MBA from Cambridge. But how
Don't
did
give
you?
him away there.
Yeah, I know. I've heard, Steve. I've heard. How did you get involved in the energy sector?
It goes way back to school time in that I was interested in sciences and engineering in particular, how problems get solved. And there were several systems and sponsorships that helped kids go through university to study engineering. And I was a benefit of one of those, and that was sponsored through university, and really enjoyed both the engineering studies, but more importantly, the rugby that I was playing there. And so the two came together, and it was a great experience. And it gave me the opportunity to see how engineers work in the world. It was actually British Gas who sponsored me through university. So I worked with them in the summers, and that was the practical experience that showed me what engineers could do. And I worked on projects all over the UK, and that sort of
What
gave
sort
me
of things would they give you to do as a young person?
sitting as the guy on a pipeline from Liverpool to in that case the Welsh coast, counting the welds and making sure that everything was done according to the spec, and then a lot of learning, a lot of starting at the bottom end, getting the tea for the welding crew, taking minutes for meetings, and just being part and just being osmosis. You pick up what's going on, and it's then relevant when you're studying the complex dynamics of oil flow through a pipeline and things like that. So it kind of made sense.
And what happened after university? So you've been interning, you get this amazing scholarship from British
So I'm
Gas.
assuming they give you a job.
They offered me a job, but so did Shell. And Shell's job was in Holland and then international. So I took the Shell job, and with the blessing of British Gas, and worked in Holland for 18 months and then Oman in the Middle East for 3 years. And again,
How old were you when you were in Oman?
I was in my mid-20s, 2 months on, 1 month off, playing rugby out there as well, and learning a lot, because as one of the expats, you were part of management, and the construction crew on several facilities reported into you, and you're building and you're responsible for it. So very good
I
experience.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oman bit. Okay.
Yeah.
What was it like working over there? You're young, you've really only ever lived probably in the UK. So you're over in a very different region of the world. What was your experience working over there, and how did you eventually bring that back to the UK and elsewhere in the world?
It gave me my first experience in how the contract world works. And the contractors were people sourced. The Middle East there's very few people there. So the contractors came in from India and Pakistan. And as the company representative, they're led by a contract lead. You interface with them, and they're responsible for building the specification that the company has designed previously. The design is usually out of Holland or out of London, and you're on the ground making sure that it happens. I got a handle on different cultures. Safety is always a huge part of any big construction project. And in the Middle East, it was fascinating to see how different cultures view safety, view the value of life. And in that culture, it was very much an Allah will look after us. And there's more to it than that. You need to wear your safety gear. You need to be thinking safety. It's not letting somebody else look after you.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you're over in the Middle East, and what pulls you back to presumably Europe or North America?
After 6 years and qualifying and being an engineer, have seen that engineers don't necessarily run the big decisions, and I wanted some commercial experience, so I applied to business schools and was accepted to one in France. And at the time, Europe was exploding, walls coming down. It was the place to be, so I jumped at the opportunity to spend a year studying in Fontainebleau, France, and again through a scholarship scheme that helped me pay for that.
Amazing. And coming out of that program in France, did you keep working in France, or did you come to North America then?
I actually went back to British Gas out of business school to a commercial role. And we acquired Consumers Gas in Toronto. My girlfriend at the time was from Toronto, and we managed to come.
How many times have I heard this story in this podcast about somebody doing this?
Finding a Canadian overseas and bringing them back.
A lot of girlfriends in Toronto.
Yeah, girlfriends and boyfriends.
So we moved to Toronto, and I worked for Consumers Gas for a while until we sold the company to Enbridge. Mm-hmm. And my wife then became my wife, and so we settled down in Toronto for a while.
So you went from this engineering practice in your early 20s. Presumably you're getting into your 30s now. You're working in more of a commercial job. What's it like working in a commercial financial role versus a engineering role? Did you start to feel like you had more decision-making power, and did you like it more than when you were in an engineering technical role? And how did you kind of bring that skill set in?
It's a different set of skills, and particularly for project development, there's so many variables. It's a very open-ended, blank piece of paper, if you like. You've got the economics to make sense, and then you've got the engineering that is part of that picture, a critical part. And so a lot of the projects that I worked on had to make economic sense, and that was really what I focused on. And then working with smart engineers, they can usually find a way of engineering things to make them work, particularly if you say, this is the budget we've got, that's all we've got. So that was an interesting expansion of my experience to that point.
Absolutely.
So we've got to talk a little rugby here, just because. So you played in university, you played in Oman.
Yeah.
Tell me about how rugby, because we've got to have this in this podcast sometime.
Got it. Yeah.
How did it influence? Like, how does it make you the man you are today? How did it influence your career? How did it make you a better engineer, better businessman? You know, what is it about rugby? We all know there's something special about it, but tell me your perspective.
Okay. Well, I think wherever I went, you could pick up a game of rugby. You'd meet people, and they'd say, "Oh, you're a rugby player. We've got a game on Sunday. Or Saturday? Can you come and join us?" And you'd make fast friends wherever you were in the world, and it would cross cultural boundaries as well. Didn't matter if you didn't really understand the language; you could probably work out what the calls were and play the game. And then the camaraderie during and after the game was phenomenal. So I think in the Middle East, I got to meet a whole rack of different people and understand a little bit about where they were coming from, their backgrounds, which were very different to my backgrounds. And even when I came to Canada, and it's a good way of understanding how I played in Toronto for a while, how different people come to the melting pot of Canada and all get along, and it makes sense.
Absolutely.
And if you can chat with somebody after a rugby game, you're going to work with them well the next week. So I've certainly gained a lot from it. And that was one of the reasons to get involved with Rugby Canada, was to go on the board and help them and give something back.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, let's get into some of the projects. This is a
Sure.
project podcast.
Yeah.
Some of the projects.
Yeah,
We're
we
gonna go way
could talk
back.
about rugby for a long time.
Yeah, we can talk about rugby. We might do it again, but
Yeah, we're going to spin all the way back to 1993. So,
Okay.
and the reason I think our folks really wanted you to talk about this project, Steve, is because Atlantic LNG was your first exposure to an LNG project. And of course, we have many LNG projects along the coast in BC and have had many in the past. Some were successful and some have failed. So obviously this project, it's one of the largest LNG export facilities in the world still, and the largest in Latin America. So can you tell us a bit more about your time there, how the project moved from a conceptual idea all the way through to a fully formed commercial entity with buyers? Can you just walk us through what that was like?
and maybe, sorry, just to interrupt, like maybe a little bit about, because we're talking about different cultures and how you have to adapt and massage a project. What was special about going to a place like Trinidad?
Sure. Well, this was, I mentioned we'd sold consumers gas, and I then was with British Gas and trying to develop what was an idea at the time, which was a project in Trinidad. British Gas had significant offshore reserves and no way to monetize those because the local market used gas, but it was saturated. So LNG projects make a lot of sense where you've got stranded gas that nobody's using and you can take it to market. In the early 90s, it was another example of the world needing energy, particularly natural gas, which is indexed to crude oil. So the crude oil price was high. Stranded natural gas was a logical thing to develop. So British Gas, together with partners Chevron and Repsol, were interested in this project. I came in as the project director, very much trying to pull things together, the commercial, the reserves, the offtake agreements, exactly what was required and has happened now in Canada. So I had that experience of how many moving parts need to come together. Trinidad was interesting in that I thought before I went there it was going to be a beautiful tropical island. Trinidad itself has been developed as an oil producing nation since the 50s and 60s and is very highly developed. In fact, where we were in La Brea, which was an old tar pit sands, way back the Walter Raleigh re-tarred his ships there. And so the tar and
This goes
oil
back to
has
Queen
been
Elizabeth,
around
the original Queen Elizabeth.
since the 1600s. So very much an oil producing nation, very proud, a very different culture, influences by, surprisingly, China, the indigenous population and the US and the South American population as well. So a very fascinating cross-section of people. The government was hugely supportive of developing natural gas as an industry, as an export industry, and everything fell into place. It was a small LNG project at the time. It was only 1 million tons, single train project. But as we hope to see in Canada, once you've built the first train, it's easier and easier to add on to that, just because you're not building the infrastructure from scratch again.
So it got up to over 14 million tons. So
Is that what it-
That is what it is now, yeah.
So how did that evolution happen? Did you go in with one train and then immediately it was a second, third, or did that happen over the course of a decade?
It took a decade, and I was only there for the first train. I
Okay.
was there for the up until financial completion on the first train. And that involved 4 partners, partner Repsol in Spain, partner in Boston, British Gas in London, and Chevron out of Texas. So I was on a plane for 3 years.
No doubt.
Trying to pull all that
So
together.
what were the headwinds? I mean, obviously, it's a success now. 1,000 fathers of success. Well, there must have been some headwinds. Like, what were the problems?
The problems were cost. And we put it out to tender, and until we had our bids back, we didn't know that this was an economic project. And Bechtel were a very strong partner for British Gas and have been since then. And they bid lump sum, fully guaranteed construction costs, together with support from the local government in the form of a tax holiday and deferred taxes. A lot of the returns on these projects you need to get as quickly as possible. So a tax deferral really helps the economics. And it was just, as in a lot of these things, Australia is another example, where it's the right economics globally that drive these projects to final investment decision. And once you're there, then it's just move as quickly as possible to get things built.
So there was no opposition at all to the project. You said that the local government and obviously the Trinidad government was very supportive, but any opposition to the project, any ENGO groups or anyone that stood up and gave you a hard time?
There were some local community groups, and we in fact moved the facility from one location to another location. Again, engineers being tasked with 6 months before financial investment to move the facility. Okay, we can do that. So they managed to, at the request of local bodies, not really an indigenous group there. I mentioned that the oil industry has been there for 60 years, and the relations were already established at that point. And then it was more the government that was supported by the community, and a relatively small community.
Just on the, so they gave you some tax holiday break, whatever you want to call it, at the beginning. I think it's important to maybe delve into that a little bit, simply because people are often like, why are governments giving these big corporations a break? But I'm going to guess that the people of Trinidad made their money back.
Oh, yes.
Hand over fist after that.
Well, the tax benefits were really for the constructor, the people who are putting their capital at risk. So in this case, British Gas, the partners, Repsol and Boston Gas Company. So they were putting their capital at risk. But once the gas is flowing, the government gets royalties. They get the income tax later on when the project is generating income, and they get a lot of employment. And certainly, even going back to my days in Oman, local employment and education was huge, and that was the same in Trinidad. We committed to employ as many Trinidadians as we could, and train as many as we could. So that kind of helps the community, and the economics. Once you expand and once you get a very successful project, everybody's doing very well out of it.
Absolutely. I'm glad that Byng drove that point home, though, because we find working on projects here in British Columbia and across Canada that there's a bad reputation that comes with companies getting quote unquote tax breaks. But when you break it down, the benefits that end up flowing to communities after 5-10 years of that tax break being provided are way larger than the break that was initially given. So I think it's an important point to focus on.
And these are big. These are long-term projects. So Trinidad 93 through to now, with already 30 years, and it's still pumping out liquefied natural gas and profits for all involved. And
it's an important piece of their economy.
Absolutely, yeah, and a diversification from oil. So it was good for Trinidad.
So you're over there in 93, and where did you go next?
By then, I realized the other area that I knew little about and was interesting was these things need financing, and you touched on the returns that the proponents need, but the banks are heavy investors, and for the Trinidad project, we financed that through a consortium of New York banks, and part of my activities was to raise that financing, and I realized that I could be a financier and I could sit on that side of the table as well. My wife was expecting our first child, who's now 30, and I wanted to get back to Canada and to Toronto, so I interviewed with the banking community and joined Royal Bank of Canada. And I was lucky enough not to be pigeonholed as a project finance guy. I went into the mergers and acquisitions group, and since then have worked on deals, which is a very exciting and interesting part of the financial markets to work in.
Absolutely. So you move back over to Canada. You're working for RBC, who we're really familiar with. They're a big player in a lot of the deals that we've certainly witnessed and been a part of. And what type of deals are you working on with RBC? And can you tell us a bit more about that and how you kind of made your way over to Prince Rupert and sort of dabbled in another LNG project over there?
Yeah, that was full circle. I was never expecting that. I started in the M&A group in Toronto, and there you're pretty much flown in for deals as they happen, a hostile takeover bid, an acquisition, a divestiture of assets. And I worked on a cross-section of Canadian businesses, from convenience stores to oil and gas companies out of Calgary to mature lifestyle
You
homes.
did diversify out there.
Yeah, and a lot of things, the financial sides of things is very similar, irrespective of the industry you're working on. My first activity or deal in BC was Sunripe Juices out of the Okanagan, which was a hostile defence at the time. It's now a Jimmy Pattison company, but at the time it was a hostile defence. I also worked on the sale of Macmillan Bloedel and did some work in the forest sector with Camfor.
To Weyerhaeuser.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
I did some community consultation on the island for them on that project.
Yeah, that was to come into Vancouver and have one of the big names to be working on a potential sale to an American company was fascinating.
And that was an iconic British Columbia company.
Absolutely.
There was a bit of blowback on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was kind of, I didn't really know that, but I learned very quickly that was the case. And there's concerns at the time of the hollowing out of particularly the forest sector in BC. And the finance side was just part of it. And the realization that the impact on the people who are working in the business is huge. And I'd learned a lot through that. And then I had the opportunity to move over and join the corporate finance team in Vancouver, and jumped at the opportunity to
You saw the mountains and you...
escape from Toronto and come to the mountains.
Come to the dark side.
It's a good word for it.
Lifestyle of Vancouver.
So is that when you started working at Terracin?
Terracin was a client initially.
Okay.
And ultimately I was approached by them and joined them in a corporate development role, and had 3 or 4 years there through the strategy and the corporate development cycles, culminating in Rich Kinder and Kinder Morgan coming in and suggesting that they'd like to buy the company.
What was that experience like, and how did that approach happen, and how did that sort of entire deal play out?
It was probably one of the fastest deals I ever worked on. Rich Kinder, David Kinder, his son, actually came up and met with me first, and we talked through the corporate strategy of Terracin, particularly the oil side, the Trans Mountain Pipeline side. And at the end of that meeting, he said, well, I think we'd like to take this further. My father will come up next week. So he came up, met with our CEO, John Reed, and the board, and we basically said the company's not for sale, public company, we're doing our own thing. And he said, well, I'll maybe make a proposal. And a week later, he made a proposal, back in the day of faxing them in, made an offer to purchase all the share capital of the company. We took that to the board and ultimately negotiated a slightly stronger deal, but also there was nobody else who would buy the company at that point, or certainly at that price. And so we accepted the offer. The shareholders were grateful and happy for the returns they got. But being part of a company and being inside of a company was a different experience for me. And the impact on the employees was huge, in that there were some employees who were happy. They were towards the end of their career and this was a nice payout. There were some who had only ever thought of working at the local gas company, working for Terracin, and were very upset about a change of control. And again, it was an American company coming in, which at the time was probably a little bit more acceptable than it would be today. But even so, it was change and worry for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. The reason why Kinder Morgan were interested in Terrason was not for the gas distribution business, it was for the oil pipeline Trans Mountain, and the opportunity to expand that. And we can talk further about how difficult it is to for a commercial entity to.
But at the time, it was sort of a non-issue.
At the time, yeah, why not? We can expand. We can just. We're Texans. We can just build another pipeline, and we'll go.
Was that kind of the mentality when they purchased the business, though? Was that real Texas-based? This is going to be easy. We're going to purchase this asset, which, it was the only thing linking Alberta to BC's coast at the time, and they were going to come in and they were going to expand it and make tons of money, and that was kind of the plan.
It was an environment where Enbridge were trying to do a big oil pipeline as well. So and Enbridge was a much bigger company to acquire. This was a bite-sized company for Kinder, and their view was, it's just like Texas. We can build a pipeline. Why can't we build a pipeline in British Columbia or across Alberta?
An English-speaking country.
Exactly. The rule of law applies.
All straightforward.
And I am not speaking for them, but they took 4 or 5 years to try and build Trans Mountain, and ultimately, when I came back into that opportunity, ultimately determined that they couldn't take the risk of building in across Alberta and BC, which is when the government stepped in to buy it.
Yes. So, banking, oil. Now we're back to LNG. So your old friends come back.
Yes.
Your old friends call you up.
Yep.
And this is when everybody's piling into LNG. So this is what we're talking. What year would this? When would they have called you up? What year would
this was? 2005, 2006.
Oh, really? So it was that much earlier before you actually conceived of the project.
Yeah, at the time, British Gas still had some reserves in northern Alberta, in northern BC, and in Alberta.
They had some upstream. Okay, I'd forgotten that. Yeah,
they had some upstream, but small, non-operated plays. So it was always sitting there as to what do we do with this. And Australia had been a huge investment and a huge expansion for the LNG industry. And then all the oil majors and the energy majors were looking for the next big thing, and Canada was it. And
when would you say that? Because, I
Canada and the U.S. Gulf Coast.
I came in to Woodfibre in like 2012, but obviously the project at that time had been somebody's dream for some time. So when did this sort of enthusiasm actually take place before they all showed up here? Like, when did you it was the first thing when you might have done this?
It would have been meetings in London and Calgary in terms of Shell and others were already starting to look around, and the industry is small enough that everybody knows where everybody's looking.
And who were you working with at the time, Steve?
I was independent. This was one of my first consulting jobs with Carbex. And at the time, British Gas didn't necessarily want to set up an office, put their flag down and say, this is what we're going to do. There's a lot of pre-work that you need to do on a desk and determine. Initially, you're ranking projects around the world. Mozambique versus British Columbia versus the Gulf Coast of the US versus Venezuela was on the table at the time, and European projects.
And what factors were you looking at? So British Gas calls you, they want to hire you as a consultant. What other places were they looking for LNG at the time other than British Columbia?
Mozambique was the biggest one.
Okay.
And very different dynamics there. And at the moment, you're not really doing a lot of engineering work. You're looking at political risk in particular and understanding what you'd have to get through to build. And most of the majors were coming off a concern from Australia where 3 projects were built within almost sight of each other, and the capital costs ballooned, the labor costs ballooned, because there wasn't enough people to work on all these projects at the same time. And that initially was a concern about Canada. There were 20 projects at one point on the docket as to potentially building, and everybody in the industry knew that would shake out to a handful.
But that I think that's important for people who listen to this podcast. It's important for Canadians to understand, is this boardroom conversation about global opportunities. So no matter how attractive or potential might exist in the jurisdiction, you're up against the world. It's not a decision about do I want to invest in BC or not. It's I've got all these opportunities. Why would I choose this over another? Like maybe delve into that a little more, and like how BC may have come up, at the time came up on top, and why later it wasn't.
Well, most big majors have a funnel of projects that you start off with 20 or 30, and they basically meet a high-level economic screening return type of calculation, a return on capital employed. And then once you've got that, you look at the political risk. You look at who else is involved. What are our relationships? Is it a rule of law that we understand? Is it will the community be welcoming? What's the labor force like? Is it sufficient to help us build this? What's our relationship with the government? How strong is the government? What can the government do for us at the various levels? So those are at the front of analysis of a project. It's much less about the engineering, somewhat about the economics, but more about the social characteristics that you need to understand, and then rank. You're almost doing a scorecard in terms of where does BC fit against other opportunities. And there was a lot of unknowns in BC compared to, I'll just use Mozambique as an example, because we went to the boardroom several times and compared the projects were comparable in terms of the size and the economics.
That's, I just got to interrupt you for a sec. It's fascinating that, who's your competitor? And British Columbians would never think this, or Canadians. My competitor in this situation was Mozambique.
Mozambique and the US would have been there as well, with known reserves. So you've got the product, you need to build it, you know what the costs may or may not be. But then how are we going to do this? What's our relationship with the government? And in Mozambique, one level of government, very good relationships with the finance function, who desperately wanted income to their country, and the Prime Minister, and a very strong and stable government. You compare that to, frankly, British Columbia, where one of the things I said at the board in London was there are 5 levels of government. And you've got the federal government, and they're supportive. The provincial government is very supportive at the moment, but that could change. Then you've got the local government, the municipalities. Then you've got the communities, and you've got the First Nations. And the First Nations are probably the most important element of understanding and key to developing projects. British Gas had been through that in many places around the world and was at the forefront of understanding what needs to be done. So the concept of benefit agreements and working with communities and education and early funding and having a presence early in a project development phase was not a hard sell to the board in London. They understood that's how business needs to be done now. It's not a matter of saying, we want to build this, we've got the government support, and that's all you need. So a lot of work up front was at the community level and at the First Nation level. So before British Gas even announced their project, we'd had meetings with the First Nations in Prince Rupert and high-level government meetings at every level, and generally putting that into the thought pattern when we had to go back and ask for more money in London.
And
how long would that have been?
That would have been a 2-year process before there was even anything in the press that British Gas was considering Canada.
And obviously these conversations were positive enough that you felt confident enough to go back and get the project funded. What were the barriers then, sort of, that could be considered phase 0? So now you're kind of in phase 1 where you've gone back and you've said, we've talked to government, we've talked to First Nations, we feel like there's a real opportunity here. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And we really want to give this an honest try. There's an opportunity. What did the next kind of set of obstacles look like that, eventually caused you to pull the project in 2013?
Well, there's some dynamics that I'll get into, but in the early stages, you said the project was funded. It was by far from funded.
Okay.
We would go to London and ask for the next phase of
Right.
risk capital.
That's what I mean. Sorry.
Very
The
high
next-
risk capital.
The next hand of money.
And even in the UK, within the engineering department that you're working with, and with the corporate department and the finance department, they'd still think of, yeah, okay, you're one of these opportunities that we're looking at, but you're not running yet. Within the team in Canada and with the team in Houston who's working on the engineering, we were all in and we were committed to this project, even though we were competing against other projects within the company, let alone other opportunities in BC. So still a very competitive dynamic. And at each point, you have to go back and ask for more capital. So we were committed as a team, but we had to go back to mum and dad almost every 6 months to a year.
We remember those days.
Yeah. So what blew it up?
Well, it kind of didn't. Another big macro issue happened. Shell acquired British Gas. Mm-hmm. Shell, their engineers loved Kitimat. The British Gas engineers loved Prince Rupert. And the maritime team with British Gas were concerned about the location of Kitimat up the Douglas Channel. And the Shell team were more developed in their project, and which project is...
And again, it had to compete.
Had to compete, and Prince Rupert came second to Kitimat. And one of the things that I would say, and this is not necessarily what the corporation would say, but the relations that Shell established with the First Nation in Kitimat, with the Haisla Nation, is second to none. And that was a competing issue, frankly, is that you've got a great relationship with one First Nation, and it could be done.
More straightforward governance. They understood the relationship. It's interesting because I do bring it up sometimes. People forget that Shell had a bunch of coal bed methane assets north of Terrace and Smithers, and were actually highly vilified, like about 10 years before that.
Yes.
They had learned.
And they sold those.
But they did learn. I mean,
Yes.
This is an important. Nobody comes into this from a point of automatic success. Like, you have to learn to develop these types of relationships. I don't know how much time we've got left, Allie, but I think we should ask Steve about. Okay, we're in the modern world right now.
Yes.
Where Prime Minister Carney, we're trying to bring everybody back to the country 10 years after maybe having a different approach. I'd like to hear your when you're having a glass of wine and talking to your friends, like, what do you think we should do as a country, particularly in this sector, the natural resource sector, but more specifically oil and gas? What do we need to do to bring things back home, to get ourselves back on our feet?
Well, let's start at the macro level. I think at the highest level, and Prime Minister Carney has realized how reliant we are on the US. We have a product in natural gas that is a global product, and it has nothing to do with the US. We can sell it to Asia, and the Shell Canada are doing a phenomenal amount with their project. There's no reason why we can't do more. And with the price of oil as it is, and the realization that oil will still be around for a while, and that Asia still needs a huge amount of energy, the macro environment is back where it was when everybody was coming to BC. Trans Mountain has demonstrated that pipelines can be built, and I think that is a strong supporter as well. I think focusing on the employment opportunities and the long-term benefits for BC will help everybody get their head around another big project. So I think people now know how to work with First Nations, with firms like Sedgwick. We've all been educated, and there are ways to do it. So it's just a matter of repeating that model and making sure that everybody is supportive and having some successes and communicating. And anywhere in the world, you've got to communicate what you're trying to do. And I think the communities, certainly in Prince Rupert when we were working there, were very supportive of the benefits that could accrue to their communities, and did accrue, even though we didn't actually build anything. There was a lot of training, a lot of support to the communities and to the First Nation groups.
So maybe I'll reword that slightly, because we like to get a little spicy with our podcast guests near the end.
Okay.
If you could offer the government some advice, maybe
Sage advice
from
a
rugby player,
And Minister Carney and his
another.
wife did come to the Rugby
Yes,
World Cup
That's
final.
right. Okay,
So he's
from
supportive.
Or the jersey.
one rugby enthusiast to another. What are two or three things we can do? I mean, Steve, you
an
have
Oxford guy, too.
an incredible depth of knowledge across finance, engineering, really all aspects of major project development, right? You touched on communications, the importance of Indigenous engagement, and we're very big proponents of Indigenous equity in these types of projects. So what are two or three things the federal and or provincial government could do to shore up, to shore up bringing back more interest in BC and in Canada in the major project sector?
There's an element, and I would say this politely, of keeping out of the way, letting the proponents do what they do. There's got to be an element of trust. And big companies know their environmental responsibilities. So one environmental procedure, or approval, whether it's led by a First Nation or whether it's led by the federal government, that's what you need. And these companies aren't coming in here to rape and pillage anymore. They're coming here to look after the environment because we've all got to live in it. So I think concerns and fears of international companies coming in and damaging the local infrastructure and the local environment should be tempered. And then the quicker you can support and let companies build, then it'll happen. There will be risks, and there may be local groups that are not supportive. But we're in a democracy, and provided they don't, those groups are heard and understood and acknowledged, they shouldn't be allowed to stop development. And we need to develop. We need to develop our resources. Canada has always been an export country, and we've got to continue to do so and compete globally.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we obviously agree with your SAGE recommendations.
This is the family business.
Yeah.
It's natural resources.
Yeah.
We have a very short window, I think, to get some more capital flowing back into Canada and to prove to our global investors, because we as Canadians aren't really investing. There aren't a lot of Canadian-owned companies that are doing these mega projects, right? The money is flowing in.
There's not enough money here, is there?
There is not.
Yeah.
And even if you look at the biggest Canadian pension funds, they're tiny compared to the infrastructure funds and other funds, state funds that would come in and support long-term contracts. And LNG is a great example of a good structured contract where you've got 20 years of commitment to start the thing. And a lot of capital is looking for those sort of long-term returns.
And we have to make it appealing for them to come back. And I say come back because a lot of these companies did come to BC in particular a decade ago. And because of some of the things that you outlined, they left, right? And so we've got to make our jurisdiction better than Mozambique in order for them to stay.
Yes, and it's happened before. If you look at the history of Canada, and the railway was funded by enterprises from outside of the country. And other industries have been supported by capital markets from all over the world. And so I don't see why that can't happen again.
Absolutely. Yeah, really good point. We've always taken global investment. That's how we've built our country, and that's how we'll continue to build our country.
Well, I think it was great.
Yeah, I enjoyed that.
I enjoyed that. And thanks, Steve, for coming in. Thanks for talking a little rugby. Thanks for coming to Canada and contributing and building some of.
Well, it's been fun, and I certainly feel Canadian through and
Yeah. Thanks, Steve, for coming on today. I think our podcast guests just all learned so much from you. I certainly learned a ton from you today. I can't wait to have an offline conversation with you about all the other things you're involved in, because you seem to be the type of guy that's involved in many projects at any given
We
time.
didn't ask him about Fortis because he's on the board now. So
Yeah. We'll have that. We worked with Fortis at Woodfibre, so we can chat about that.
Good people.
Really good people. Well, thanks so much for everyone that listened to today's episode of Primary Risk. Please follow us to receive notifications of upcoming episodes wherever you might get your podcast. Check out out the show notes for references. Steve went over a ton of different companies and projects that he's worked on in his tenure. We'll post those. And new episodes are going to be released monthly. I know Byng and I have been a little bit tardy on our monthly release, but we've been a little busy here at Sedgwick trying to build some of these major projects. But we'll be back with another episode in April. I believe we're having someone on from Silasums, which is very exciting. So until the next episode, thanks so much for coming in, Steve, and thanks for everyone that tuned in.
Thank you, Allie.
Thank you.
Thank you.